All right, get ready. This one stings a little bit. So the guy's holding an RPG, like a rifle. He's got, God. He lives. He survives. All right, you don't have to worry about that. There's a blast that goes out the back of the RPG. That's why you'll see people set it on their shoulder, and the blast goes behind him. I think he put the back end of that weapon system directly into his, like, the pocket on his shoulder, which, like, that's just going to shred some bones. But he's alive. He survived. You think he actually tells his buddy what happened? Like, blames it on the weapon? Say, I don't know, malfunction. I did everything right. All right, today we've got a thermobaric RPG being used in Ukraine. Ukrainian forces going through amphibious training. The Russian answer to the US HIMARS and a 2S1 self-propelled howitzer. But first, a quick thank you to today's sponsor. Scheels has everything you need to enjoy the great outdoors, whether that's hiking, camping, shooting, fishing, or hunting, which is kind of on my mind. I was just out checking the trail camera pictures this last week because deer season starts here in Middle Tennessee in about a month. So here's a couple of the bucks roaming around that specific piece of public land. Set up a couple blinds. Think I'm ready, but last couple items had to be picked up. So I headed over to Scheels, where I picked up some new broadheads and a new grunt call. Now, I really like these Magnus fixed blade broadheads, but for whatever reason, most of the stores here in town either don't sell them or they're always out of stock. So, fortunately, Scheels has a pretty wide selection on just about everything. So I'm really not a very good hunter. I'm trying to get better. I enjoy being out there, and I love being able to provide food for my family. So if you got any tips or suggestions for this coming deer season, throw them in the comments below. And of course, be sure to check out Scheels, who offers price matching, free returns, and free exchanges for all of your outdoor needs. All right, wait till you see the size of this thing. This is a thermobaric RPG. It's like a gas cylinder on the end of that thing. And it's a pretty sizable explosion. Look at that. I mean, it's a lot bigger than the traditional fragmentation warheads you see him firing here. We're going to talk more about what thermobaric warheads, what they do, how deadly they can be, and in comparison with some of these more traditional high explosive or fragmentation type rounds. So the way a thermobaric warhead works, whether it's dropped from a bomb, fired from a missile or a rocket, or in this case an RPG, there are even thermobaric grenades, is it's kind of like a dual stage type warhead. So the first explosion goes off and it spreads a gas. A lot of places will describe it almost like an aerosol, so like a flammable gas cloud. So the benefit to that, and as they're using it here in Ukraine, is when we're using that against a trench system or a fortified position, that gas can seep in around the edges, right? If a soldier is behind a sandbag or underneath overhead cover with logs laid out on top of the trench, a shrapnel round might not be able to get through that. The sandbag might do the trick to protect the soldier from what's coming out of that warhead. But a thermobaric warhead, that gaseous cloud, it seeps right over the sandbag, right around the sandbag, or right down through the cracks in the overhead cover. And then when that second charge goes off, it ignites that cloud, creating a pretty substantial explosion. If we go back to the video, you can see just how big that boom is from the thermobaric warhead compared to the more traditional standard fragmentation type rounds. Overall, these thermobaric warheads are pretty nasty, in terms of the type of casualty they produce on the battlefield. And, I feel like I'm risking getting into comparing, being wounded one way is better than another way, or being killed on the battlefield one way is somehow, less bad than it happening by another weapon system. And that's an impossible scale. But, this isn't even throwing shade. The US we have quite a few thermobaric warheads in our arsenal and use them in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But the way that these will inflict wounds and kill people on the battlefield is really twofold. So first, you have that blast, the large blast. As the gas expands, it's going to create a much larger blast area than your traditional high explosive round. So that thermobaric RPG, for instance, has a lethal radius of 10 meters. By comparison, the HE round, the second round he fired, or the fragmentation round, the second round that he fired, has a lethal radius of 7 meters. So the blast is one way to cause casualties. That gas spreading around you, you're getting down into your foxhole while you're trying to take cover, and then igniting. That is, one way it causes casualties. The second big way, and this one's kind of nasty, so be prepared, has to do with why this weapon system is also called a vacuum bomb. So after that large fireball goes off, of course, people inside that blast are killed or wounded, as you would expect. But those outside then have to deal with essentially a vacuum being created by the overpressure. So as the explosion goes off, it sucks in oxygen from the surrounding area, and it can cause essentially invisible wounds to people that at first glance look like they may have survived the explosion or they're outside the blast radius. But that pressure, that vacuum, can actually rupture internal organs. So the soldier, you might look at him as they're sitting there on the battlefield and think, this guy, no burn marks, no shrapnel, he's okay. But 60, 90, 120 seconds later, the guy's dead because of the internal damage caused by this thermobaric weapon or vacuum bomb in the general vicinity. And there's no way to treat that, right? Like at all. And that's one of the reasons that I say this is a pretty nasty weapon system. A traditional artillery round, high explosive, shrapnel producing, say it lodges some pretty significant chunks of metal in somebody's leg. If you're able to get over there early enough, or if they're conscious and they can apply a tourniquet, maybe pack the wound and get off the battlefield, who knows, maybe they can save their leg, or maybe they don't and they lose the leg but they survive. But when you're talking about ruptured organs that you can't even tell something happened to the person at first glance, like there's nothing you can do for that person. All right, here we've got Ukrainian forces conducting an amphibious assault against Russian position. No, I'm just kidding. This is a training exercise somewhere in England over the last few months. So these are Ukrainian forces being trained by the British. Now, I think what you're seeing here is most likely what you're going to see in Ukraine for the most part in terms of what amphibious operations could look like. That is small craft, infiltration type techniques, special operations forces, sabotage groups. That seems much more likely than any sort of large scale, battalion, brigade, division size assault across either the Dnieper or even the Black Sea into Crimea. However, I do think there's a small chance. When looking over the Russian positions and how they built those over the last, 12 or so months, there's a lot of conversation as to how you go about beating that. What's the best way to defeat those Russian defensive positions? And I have said in the past, kind of tongue-in-cheek, the best way is to go around them, right? Like you don't want to take those things head on. Why would you ever, given the opportunity, want to assault directly into an area where the enemy is expecting you and has built up their defenses to, stop you? There are a couple ways you could do that. You could go over with helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft, paratroopers kind of thing. I don't know that Ukraine has that force capability baseline, but even if they did, kind of a death wish, right? The surface-to-air threat in Ukraine, especially at the front, is significant. So there's a high likelihood if Ukraine tried to send let's call it a battalion of paratroopers over the front into Russian-occupied territory, like there is a significant chance that aircraft gets shot down before it even gets close to the objective area. So that's realistically not a good option. The other, in terms of going around, would be some sort of amphibious landing. Now, much of the area by Kherson is still defended by Russian positions. They do have substantial defensive lines to the east of the river. And, the Dnieper is not really designed for a large-scale battalion, brigade, division size amphibious operation. It's just that the Ukrainian forces on their side of the river are still under Russian observation. They're in range of Russian artillery, missile, and rocket fire. So you're not going to be able to mass a sizable force on that bank, move it across. The Dnieper's big, but it's not that big. And then, surprise and mass forces across a river like that. You're not going to be able to get all three aspects of those very likely. I mean, you could move small groups over one at a time, and it does look like that's something Ukraine's been doing for quite a while. I mean, it's been like 2 months, and they've got this little foothold on the eastern side of the river. But that's not, again, we're not talking about tanks and artillery pieces being moved across. It's light infantry on relatively small craft. The other place where I think there is a slight possibility that Ukraine actually could conduct some sort of amphibious operation, again, not entirely clear what their capabilities are on that front, how many troops they have set aside to do something like this, but it wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world if they attempted some sort of amphibious assault across the Black Sea into Crimea. All right, got to interject here real quick. So after recording this video and before publishing, it looks like Ukraine carried out some sort of amphibious operation in Crimea. Now, there's still a lot of information coming out on that front. Maybe a good topic for a future video, but it sounds like roughly a platoon size element conducted a raid. So 20 to 30 soldiers landed in Crimea, carried out a handful of operations, and then exited the area, moving back to Ukrainian-held territory. Now, what you're going to hear in a second is my talking about kind of a larger scale amphibious operation with the idea of landing, staying there, and potentially opening up a new front in the war. So essentially, this is just a disclaimer. What you're about to see is not intended in any way to suggest that I predicted this raid into Crimea, because I didn't. What I'm talking about here in a second is an amphibious operation in Crimea of a scale that we haven't yet seen in this war. The reason I say that is Crimea as a peninsula already is kind of in a tenuous position for Russia to hold, right? Given given your options, you would never really like to hold a peninsula. It's a tough ask in a military sense. Now, over the last few months, Ukraine has continually struck some of the bridges crossing into Crimea, somewhat restricting the flow of equipment and material and personnel, into and out of that area. And of course, there's been increased use of Ukrainian USVs, unmanned surface vessels, targeting Russian warships all across the Black Sea, some even pretty close to Crimea itself. And what that's done, big picture, is forced a lot of these Russian naval vessels back towards their home ports, where there's more protection, more safety, as opposed to just out patrolling across the Black Sea. Both of these things, the attacks against bridges connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland and USVs against Russian naval vessels, they're problems for Russia by themselves. Like, if you do nothing else on top of that, it's an issue that Russia has to deal with and defend against going forward. But if you step back a little bit, they also could be considered kind of setting the conditions for some sort of future amphibious operation against the Crimean Peninsula. That said, any sort of major amphibious operation like that is incredibly risky. I mean, Ukraine could possibly have the entire assault force killed or captured, essentially out of the fight for the rest of the war. It's not just a matter of, sneakily getting your troops on shore without the enemy knowing, but, in this case, Ukraine would have to keep that corridor open to, establish and maintain the bridgehead to keep their troops resupplied, get the wounded out when possible, and then somehow have a bubble of air defense around that beachhead so they weren't, susceptible to just continuous attack by Russian fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft. This here is the Russian HIMARS. It's called Tornado S, but it's essentially the Russian answer to the US HIMARS. You can see a wheeled multiple launch rocket system designed to fire precision munitions. So, big picture, stepping back, Russia and the Soviet Union have always kind of been the leaders when it comes to rocket artillery, in the sense that they had the most of it. They always relied more heavily on it than we did in the United States. And, late in the Cold War, the U.S. kind of figured out we're a little far behind on the rocket front. We got the cannon artillery figured out, where we got a lot of stuff going when it comes to our Air Force, but rocket artillery, we're lagging. So the U.S. came out with the M270 and eventually the Mike 142 HIMARS, which of course now is getting a lot of use in Ukraine. About 25 years ago, Russia started developing this here, the Tornado models of multiple launch rocket systems. The Tornado G is based on the BM-21. The Tornado S that you see here is based on the Smerch. This one here carries 12 300mm rockets with a stated range out to 120 kilometers, and Russia says it has a degree of accuracy inside of 10 meters, which, that would be, if that's all correct, it's a pretty impressive system. Now, the big difference here, because the traditional Smerch had a range between 70 and 90 kilometers, so it's different rockets here, but it's that the rockets and the launcher system, the Tornado S, are built to rely upon and utilize GLONASS, which I always feel like I'm mispronouncing. It's the Russian version of GPS. That is the major change here, all things considered, for Russia. So rather than going for mass, a ton of unguided rockets fired in one specific location, they've started to use, with some of these more advanced, some of their newer multiple launch rocket systems, relying more on precision, utilizing GLONASS, or again, the Russian version of GPS. Now, we haven't seen a ton of these being used during the war in Ukraine, which, there's a couple aspects there. For one, the Russian Ministry of Defense in this video said that this was a fire mission in Ukraine. Very well could have been a training session. Hard to tell when you're that far back from the lines, like this type of system would be used. Now, on the one hand, Russia doesn't have a ton of these. Again, they just started manufacturing these inside the last 25 years, so there's not a ton of them in the force. Additionally, when it comes to mobile, long-range, precision strike capabilities, we're not seeing a lot of those systems destroyed in this war. Right? I mean, think about the HIMARS in Ukrainian service. They're not putting those things up on the front line and risking being hit by Russian drones or helicopters or traditional cannon or even rocket artillery. Ukraine is firing those from far enough back to where at least most of those are not a real threat in any sort of counter battery fire. And Russia's largely going to be doing the same thing, right? They're not going to put the Tornado right up there on the front lines. They could be firing this from 20, even 30 kilometers back from the front lines, where there are very few Ukrainian systems that can effectively engage as some sort of counter battery fire. This is a 2S1, which is a 122 millimeter self-propelled howitzer. It's essentially a D30 mounted on top of an MTLB, which, as common sense as that sounds in a lot of ways, it's actually not that common. But anyways, fun little fact here. This is an old Soviet system, built in the 1970s. but was originally designed and manufactured in Kharkiv, Ukraine. So when talking about the cannon and the chassis and the differences there, when you look at most self-propelled howitzers, be it the 2S3, the 2S19, the American Paladin, anything like that, it's generally like its own system. I mean, when you look at the Paladin, it's not like they took the cannon from a 777 and mounted it to the top of the Bradley and bam, you got a self-propelled howitzer. That is kind of what happened here, which is interesting if you think about it, right? So you've already got the D-30 howitzers and you've already got the MTLBs. What if you just put the two together and now you've got this kind of amphibious, relatively light, weighs half as much as a 2S3 self-propelled howitzer. The benefit of this, I think, just outside looking in, is you have people that are familiar with the MTLB chassis and how that system operates, and you have people familiar with the D-30 cannon and how that operates. You could bring them together and outfit, a 2S1 type unit. It doesn't work like that. Again, in the United States, if you've got people proficient on the 777, there's a lot of skills they carry over to help with the Paladin, but there's a lot of differences there too. And somebody who knows how to operate and maintain a Bradley or an Abrams, it's really not the same moving into a Paladin. A lot of similarities, but not, the one-to-one match that we have here with the 2S1. It's kind of a, all things considered, pretty unique system. But that is all I've got for now. For those of you interested in national security, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. It's, direct to your inbox at least once a week between, we'll say, 7 and 15 major topics, with summaries and links out to the original articles so you can do more research if interested. We have, podcast recommendations in the national security space, and of course a handful of videos that I think are interesting coming out of the war in Ukraine that we just can't always share here on YouTube. But if interested, the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.